welcome back. So I'm going to start by telling you kind of, what I want to do today. I'll start basically where we left off. So let me go to the papers first. Basically, the papers that I'm talking about today is like ultimately, big picture for me. This business of moving past the ABCs, right? The letter freedom stuff that I ended with last time. I see it as requiring, so to speak, 4 steps, and today is basically about the first 2. And then the third and fourth is tomorrow. The third and fourth also involves that paper by Ismail that I signed, and so I think that's another thing that tomorrow we'll have an occasion to talk about. And I'll also show you all 4 steps in full then. But so this is like the beginning, and as I'll explain, I take the beginning to be something that I'm directing not just conditionally at anyone who shares the goal of letter freedom, but kind of anyone in this broadly naturalistic camp. So I hope that's relevant, and I'm going to start by saying something about what I mean by that. Okay, so but this is the overview. I'll now argue. This is more of I'll argue for a claim that is something like this. That the term B theory or block universe view has been sort of used in a way that's ambiguous, in a way that I think matters. There's like an ambiguity that matters in this broadly naturalistic camp, which I take many of us to be in. And I will suggest that disambiguation between what I think of as the official B theory and what I'll call sort of meta-B stands. And I'll tell you about what I mean by that. And then there'll be sort of, this is the substance of the talk today, kind of 2 case studies. I think of that ambiguity as sort of manifested in many different places. And the reason I picked these 2 bits of text is that I'm also just interested in them for various reasons. And then I will say something about the disadvantages and advantages of disambiguating this towards meta-B, so to speak, and then there'll be the final step, and so that's the kind of basic overview, so for now the take-home message is just this is the beginning of a way to a goal that I think is worthwhile. Okay, so as I said at the end last time, basically one motivation for wanting to move past the ABCs, I think, would be a naturalistic outlook, broadly speaking, without defining exactly what that is. I think I'm sufficiently, in line with some naturalistic ideas for that to be maybe part of the motivation. I think there could be other motivations too. We can talk about that if you're interested in other, metaphilosophical stances. For example, ones that take metaphysics to be really kind of methodologically autonomous. I do say here that I'm not sure about the methodological component, at least the way that Nina Emery formulates it, like I said last time. But in any case, so I think the goal of moving past ABCs is at least kind of important to explore, and it has an affinity with naturalism, not the same thing. It has an affinity. Now, as came up in actually in informal discussion yesterday, I want to relate this to something that Carrie McKenzie says in her piece in the, I think, Philosophy Beyond Space-Time volume. So her point there is that she says, the conflict between, let's say, presentism, remember roughly the view that only the present exists, between presentism and relativity theory, has been well explored, well documented, and it has kind of made eternalism, by which I think she means static eternalism, or what I call the B theory, a paradigm doctrine of naturalistic metaphysics, which she says is somewhat odd. Now, her reason to think it's odd is that, we don't have a final physical theory, and there's, not much reason to think that in terms of like fundamental metaphysics, like in terms of fundamental ontology or ideology, our current physical theories approximate the final physical theories which we don't have, so there seems to be a little point in trying to figure out fundamental ontology or ideology. In other words, if you're a naturalist and you want to be guided by science or by physics and metaphysics, how can you be an eternalist based on relativity theory or something like this? Now, I take it that, you know, philosophers of quantum gravity, and also Baptiste has kind of helpfully responded to this, take that as confirmation that temporal metaphysics should look to future physics, or, you know, physics that's being developed to ascertain the fate of ABC positions. And of course, I have no qualms with that, but I think that we should also leave conceptual room for a more complete departure from the ABCs, and here are some of my reasons, kind of more specifically in this context. So, another reason to think that this is odd, I think, which may also be implicit in her discussion, is that, you know, naturalistic metaphysics has kind of prided itself on its distance from analytic armchair metaphysics. I mean, this is almost just a sociological fact, but not just, I think. I mean, like we saw yesterday, eternalism, static eternalism, the B theory, and this will be a big theme today, it's a metaphysical view. It's, you know, it's anti-realism about things. There's some pretty heavy metaphysical machinery that goes into setting it up. So if, you know, if naturalistic metaphysics kind of means moving away from some of those metaphysical categories, analytic categories, to shape our inquiry, at least it's not as complete a departure as you might imagine, might be possible. So in other words, another way to put this point is, Mackenzie says, you know, naturalistic metaphysics is kind of metaphysics that lets relevant science inform both the metaphysical questions we deem it appropriate to ask and the answers that we give to them. And I guess my sense is that, you know, if we look to theories of quantum gravity to try and find out whether eternalism is now, you know, vindicated or something like that, while that is interesting, I think we are, you know, letting the science inform the answers, but not the questions. Because I think, really the question still is the question that I started with, the question of dynamicity, and that's, so that it's just, it's a different approach. And maybe just one more thought on this. I think because the kind of meta-ontological worries that I voiced yesterday, and the ongoing discussions about, for example, whether positivism even has a core and so on, because all of that is naturally classified as analytic and armchair, I actually think that this version of naturalistic metaphysics that you know, one might practice in the context of quantum gravity is a little bit conservative, because it kind of doesn't, it's somewhat disconnected from the ongoing discussions about what may or may not be at stake, even in the ABCs. Okay, so back to letter freedom, you've seen some of the slide. So I say, I kind of like Callender's vision. I'm interested in seeing how one might get there, amongst other things, because thinking in ABC terms has not led in explanatorily fruitful directions. I will talk a little bit about temporal experience later on today, where it's relevant. Okay, so the goal of letter freedom is something like this: to be able to philosophize about time and temporal experience without ever framing questions in ABC terms, even implicitly. Now, clearly this is less restrictive than naturalistic philosophy of time, in a sense, because what I'm about to tell you, especially this third and fourth steps tomorrow, are clearly coming from the armchair. Like, you know, I'm using philosophical methodology here, whatever that is, not scientific, and so it's less restrictive, I suppose, in that sense, than naturalistic philosophy of time. It's also more restrictive for the reason I just mentioned. Like, this is really, you know, ABC work that one can do in philosophy of quantum gravity. that would be ruled out by this, but I mean, that may seem kind of overly restrictive at the moment, but I think by the end, and as I talk more about letter freedom and what I think it takes to kind of consistently get it, I think it would be clear to you at least why, for me, that would be ruled out. I think these are kind of incompatible approaches in a way. I mean, not that one can't take both on occasion, but it's just a different approach. Now, I think on the whole, it's not easy to be stably letter-free. So, for example, not mentioning the ABCs, I don't think is well. It sometimes is enough, I think, for remaining letter-free, but sometimes isn't. So, I mean, for example, you know, if what you're thinking, I mean, there are certain kinds of questions that I think are easy, where it's easy to stay away from the ABCs, and those are also important. Maybe exploring the space of space-time models in general relativity, like maybe Dennis in that book, or you know, thinking about well, conceptual and mathematical underpinnings of emergence of space-time and quantum gravity. I actually think conceptual, you know, that's a kind of area where it's threatened, but especially if it's the mathematical underpinnings of the emergence of space-time that you're investigating, I think, yes, that's by itself letter-free. I think the broader the project becomes, and especially if you're thinking also about the manifest image of time, then it becomes harder. Now, here's a worry that one might have. I don't know if this occurred to you, but so in philosophy of time, you know, one reaction that there has been to the critique of analytic armchair methods has been to look to experimental philosophy, right? To you know, stop talking about like, what we think about time and what is, you know, which kinds of beliefs are part of the manifest image without checking, so to speak, without, you know, giving surveys to people and checking. And so I want to say a little bit about this because it is clearly a naturalistic stance in philosophy of time. But the reason you might think that that conflicts with what I'm doing here is that, well, some of the results, in particular by Christy Miller and others, suggest that there is a prevalence of, you know, atheoretic views, at least in the population studied. And now, you know, if that's the case, then the letters are right there in our heads, right? So, you know, if you're still interested in the manifest image, then they're going to be there, and in the manifest image. And so you will be led to consider letterful questions when you're concerned with human time. If people think in A terms. For example, then you have to ask, okay, are those beliefs false? Are they true? You know, how does that relate to the perception of time? How does it relate to our differential attitudes towards the past and the future? And so on. So here's my stance on this. We can talk more if you want, but in brief, I interpret these results a little bit differently. I guess I think of them as uncovering at most, you know, dispositional facts, but it almost sounds a little tautological, but so, you know, when you present people with lettered vignettes, it's true that a majority of people apparently is disposed towards dynamic views, towards A rather than B views. I think it's still interesting. I'm not inclined to go further and say, therefore, people in general have tacit atheoretic models in their minds. So I think, you know, if there is a conflict here, it's more kind of maybe with the motivation. Like maybe if one adopts the goal of letter freedom, there may be less motivation to present people with vignettes that have A, B, C theoretic description, and also D theoretic descriptions of timeless models. Okay, so now here's the thing I was talking about earlier, the ambiguity in B theory or block universe. Now, to begin with, as I said at the start, I'm using, you know, A and B, A versus B such C, so broadly. I'm simplifying so much of the landscape that, of course, there's also ambiguities. But what I have in mind here is a little bit different. It's something like this. So, I took this to be the kind of first step to letter freedom. Consider the following distinction. Okay? There is the B theory, which says that time is passage-free, right? I told you it's, by definition, says there is no robust passage. Now compare that with the stance that says it's not helpful to trade in eternalism. I'm not going to engage with passage talk. Now I say stance deliberately because it's not a theory as such, it's not a rival theory, so you could have it for different reasons. It's not even a fixed metaphysical view. You know, it refuses to assent to the sentence, time passes robustly, but without justifying that with the claim that time is passage-free. So it mentions aterminology but doesn't use it. Whereas the B theory uses it to deny that time is like that. Now this is not just a terminological suggestion, this is a substantive claim, so I will argue for this in a moment. And, you know, not everyone will agree, I think. But anyway, so if if you think that, for example, some of this talk is not intelligible, or that there are merely verbal disagreements going on, or something like that, then that will constitute a move to meta B. But that's not the only reason, and also you're not required to think this in order to have a meta B stance. The meta B is basically the stance that, well, we can talk of a succession of times, as we often do also in physical theories, but we don't mean by that at the fundamental level of temporal reality there are only tenseless facts and all that other stuff, because we might not have chosen to consider this question of whether A or the B series is fundamental. Okay, so, if we allow for this distinction, actually, let me argue for this a little bit more. Okay, so on my terminology, the B theory is a positive metaphysical view, but one with a negative claim at its core, namely that time is passage-free. In my view, that fits with the way that the B theory is generally presented. No time is metaphysically privileged, the present is not special, and so on. No passage of time, which is why I call this the official reading. This is just to say I find this kind of explication in the literature, in metaphysics literature. It's a positive metaphysical view with a negative claim at its core, and the claim is that time does not pass in that way that the A theory explicates. Now, is that really right? Does the B theory need to rely on A vocabulary? Go back to Oliver Cooley's paper for a moment. He says, is an exhaustive catalogue of which events occur, how they are temporally related, a complete account of temporal reality. I define the B theorist as someone who answers this question in the affirmative. The imagined exhaustive description is assumed to be tenseless, holding once and for all from no temporal point of view. That's all well and good, but I think the next question would be, what does that mean to have a complete tenseless description of time? This is a metaphysical view. What does it mean? And he tells us in the rest of the paper what it means. As we've seen, the rest of the paper is about non-standard A theories. It's the view that is opposed to time being like that. To say that the description holds once and for all means that it excludes a change in tensed facts. So, we're understanding this, I think, by reference, by gesture towards the A theory. Another objection might be, is meta really so metaphysically uncommitted? And I don't want to deny that it could be combined with metaphysical stances on some questions or other, but I think then we have to identify a question like that first. Like we saw yesterday, at least I tend to think it takes a lot of work to formulate a question here in the intended way. And so, for example, just starting with sort of ordinary language claims that we all make, like time flies when you're having fun, or talk about succession and duration too. That by itself doesn't outline a metaphysical question because both sides will be committed to accommodating those things as true. That's exactly why talk of robust passage first comes about, in order to make clear that we're talking about something more fundamental than that. So that's my stance on making this distinction. Now, it's kind of no wonder, I think, that the two have been conflated on occasion, if I'm right about that. Quote Callender on this as well. So it is, of course, usually atheorists that have seemed to need lettered resources, because they've said, our view is clearly better because we experience time as dynamic, and I can explain that, and so on. And the B theorist was kind of just standing back and saying, no, I don't think so. It can have seemed like it's the atheorists, like the presentists, who are endorsing particular metaphysical models of time, whereas the B theorists are just like a default position. But I think the default position that we really mean, like there is a default position, meta B, that would be, that's much more minimal. Just a final point on this, I think the history of philosophy of time also shows this, because B theorists used to follow McTaggart in arguing that the A series is incoherent, which I would say has fallen somewhat out of fashion. But what we get now often is the claim that A notions are unintelligible. And I think that's an important shift because, for McTaggart, he was saying, the A series can't exist, and that's why time is unreal and so on. But he still knew what it would be for there to be an A series. Whereas, if A notions are unintelligible, as for example Simon Prosser recently said explicitly, I think that's a move, step outside of the A-B debate altogether. Okay, now, much of the talk will be kind of my reasons for thinking that ambiguity matters, and maybe before I get into these, I want to say also, so the case studies that I will be talking about, the case studies are supposed to be support also for why the ambiguity matters. Actually, let me go through this slide first before saying this. Okay, so suppose you're not particularly wishing for letter freedom yourself right now. I think one reason that it matters is that we care about conceptual hygiene. Why does ambiguity matter? I think when it's central to a lot of work, then it matters because it leads to equivocation, which has some drawbacks. More specifically, B and meta B are incompatible. That's my problem with this. In other words, when this sort of back and forth between B and meta B serves some philosophical purpose, as I'm going to argue it has, that's a problem because B assumes something that is not compatible with meta B, namely that it is helpful to trade in A terminology because time is passage-free. Yeah. Okay, and of course for friends of letter freedom, which is what will matter to me most, there's a real dilemma here because, and I'll talk more about that later, as you'll see, while meta B is nice and clean, you've really stepped away, it's a very minimal stance. There are no things then that you can't say that people often want to say in these contexts. Again, case studies will bring this out, I hope, but I'll talk more about it later as well. And so meta B was the unlettered alternative, right? The B theory is not unlettered. So that's a dilemma there, I think, for anyone who is interested in letter freedom. And so that's what I'll illustrate. And now here's my comment before looking at the first case study. I think this is also, like I said, I find this in conceptual indecision in a lot of places, and it's also something that I relate to. That is, I feel like I and lots of other B theorists are in this position. of kind of being undecided about this. All right, so this paper, as I take it, grew out of an interdisciplinary meeting to try and figure out a while back, whether physics has a need for passage, and in particular whether theories of quantum gravity, as they're being developed, need to look to the notion of passage. And overall, as you can tell from the title, of course, Hackett's answer is no. And I mean, I think it's even, so you could ask whether in this paper it's Hackett's business or his opponents to resolve this ambiguity. I take that point. Maybe what we really should say is that there's somehow fuzziness in the subject matter. What I want to illustrate is just that the difficulty is there and what it does. So I'm going to talk about two parts of the paper. The first one is a little bit less central, I think, to the point, but it sort of course fits our topic. So the point I'm making here is very simple. One thing that Hackett considers in this paper is this idea of there being two times, okay? A more fundamental time and then the ordinary physical time, which emerges as a higher level phenomenon. And calls a set theory, the ordinary time would be the time internal to the space-time derived from the call set, whereas the fundamental one would be the time in which the call set grows. And now, Hackett's point is that we have to interpret this in a particular way for it to be dynamic. Obviously, there's lots of other things that have been said and can be said about this interpretation. My point of interest for me here is that he says, what you really need is you need the temporal relations between the ordinary times and the fundamental times to be physically distinct from the ones just between ordinary times, because the ones between ordinary times, just ordinary space-time, those are unchanging E relations, whereas, potentially you could have, but he doesn't use the word, but effectively A relations between the times. In other words, at some ordinary time, might be present at big T equals 1, and some other ordinary time might be present at big T equals 100, or rather much larger number. So then, with respect to the fundamental time, the present changes, time passes. My point about this is just that that's an a-theoretic model, and yet Hackett also says, McTaggart's absolute present is really no use at all in an account of passage. Just McTaggart doesn't provide a useful clue for incorporating passage into physics. Okay, now there's an incompatibility there. There you might think you can just get rid of this comment. But I think this same ambiguity plays a more central role, a subtle but central role in another part of the paper. So another thing that Hackett wants to do, as I understand it in this paper, is to kind of make explicit how much of our basic mathematics amounts to a theory of time already, so to speak, like how much is contained in there already, with respect to passage stuff. So, first of all, both discrete time and continuous time include passage in certain senses already. Let's say thin passage is included. For example, the idea that there's more than one time. I think that's an important ingredient. Or that there's at change, so that things have different incompatible properties at different times. You can have all those things. And now, in continuous time, a new aspect of passage must be represented, which has to do with basically our understanding of limits and how quantities reach their values. And what we would need for this thick passage thing, which for our purposes we need a robust passage, is a logically independent account of how an independent variable reaches its value. In other words, how T approaches T now in this account of limits. He says, for clearly understandable reasons, that's what we need, right? For robust passage. But That's not what we get in our basic mathematics. All we have in the kind of usual formulations is, well, this gets defined holistically. If you're close enough, the independent variable, and the dependent variable close enough. So the point is, no part of this epsilon delta definition has a meaning by itself. And now, he comments on a take on this by mathematicians who say, something that is real to the intuition is left out by the definition. And no mathematician need or should lose the suggestive intuitive feeling expressed by talk of the independent variable moving or tending to its value. About this, Hagel says, he rejects this suggestion that some reality is missed by the mathematics. Yes, there's a limit to what the mathematics represents, but it doesn't follow that anything lies beyond. I think that's a really interesting thought, and it suggests that our basic mathematics contain everything there is already. There was nothing else to incorporate. There's nothing left out. And yet, to argue for this bold claim, we have to have some concept of thick passage. We have to have the concept in order to say what the mathematics would be required to provide. In other words, to make this also interesting claim that thick passage requires this thing in bold, and therefore the claim that mathematical physics strongly resists modifications aimed to represent a thicker, dynamic, robust sense of passage. We have to have some idea of what thick passage would be. And now that means there are some questions left, namely, we can put this very simply as follows. When Hagel puts these brackets around imagined, our existing theories therefore adequately represent the physics of passage in this thin sense without requiring any imagined, thicker, dynamical notion. This is the point at which I think there is a decision conceptually in the background, namely about whether the notion itself is merely imagined. In other words, whether the concept exists. Either we know what those words refer to, or we don't. It just means the decision is, is this dissatisfaction just brought on by some confused talk? That would be more the meta he stands. Or is it about thick dynamic passage? That would be B, or, he's talking about an A-theoretic model earlier. Yeah, the latter stands. So I think this is a choice. And unfortunately, in this case at least, neither choice really, fits all of the interesting discussion. So to sum up about this paper, I think, there's this unresolved tension. The first part effectively explores an A-theoretic interpretation of causal set theory, while also taking McTaggart's letters to be a conceptual dead end. And this latter part, similarly makes a point about how thick dynamic passage sits uneasily with basic mathematics, while also dismissing the notion as merely imagined. Okay, let me go to the second case study. Now this is actually, this is an earlier paper where that was originally for an exchange at an IAPT conference where Callender replied. It was an attempt to kind of make sense of the methodological recommendation that the book offers to philosophers of time. And so I now see this as, I already saw it then, but certainly now see it as part of a wider problem that certainly doesn't arise just here. But, okay, so what makes them special has, as you'll recall, this aim to explain how various features of manifest time arise when they are not included in physical time. And here's a sort of methodological bit of background. Of course, you know that he wants us to move past the ABCs, but also there's a sort of metaphilosophical stance here, which is something like this, or he quotes computer scientists. Whenever it's been possible to make definite progress on ancient philosophical problems, such progress has almost always involved a kind of bait and switch. In other words, one replaces an unanswerable philosophical riddle by a merely scientific or mathematical question which captures part of what people have wanted to know when they've asked Q, and then with luck one solves Q prime. Replaced by Q prime. This process of breaking off answerable parts of unanswerable riddles and then trying to answer those parts is the closest thing to philosophical progress that there is. So what I want to do is tell you my reasons for thinking that it's hard to square this with what actually happens in the book about manifest time, in brief. And then tell you also why I think it does some philosophical harm, ultimately to this explanation of why we experience time as flowing. Since it's just a case study in our context, I want to make it brief, but I will also try to make it clear. So the bait and switch, right? That's what officially is happening, and Steve Savitt in his review of the book kind of has to sort of make some choices about, like guesses about what are examples for Callender of big questions and small questions. And I think the choices he makes don't fit, but it's a very understandable problem because, so here are the features of manifest time that are kind of very important to Callender's project in the book. In a nutshell, I think what we get is in the book, it's like this. We start off by asking about our sense of the present as special, but then, that's a big question, right? Then we end up asking smaller queries about, for example, how we perceive synchrony, how the brain, so to speak, creates an impression of synchrony. But what's ultimately inferred from that is a lesson about A. In other words, the conclusion of those chapters is the metaphysician is present, the theory is present, or rather the experience on which it's based gets fragmented by cognitive science. Similarly, there's discussions of, for example, how when we learn to temporally decenter, or when autobiographical memory arises. Ultimately, that all stands in the service of answering B and C. What it culminates in is a theory of how creatures like us might come to model time as flowing and the future is open. Now, you might think, again, so what, right? Like maybe maybe the rhetoric is a little strong with the moving past the ABCs, but that's not really essential to kind of the explanation. Philosophically, where's the harm, in rejecting a field that houses the very question you're answering? To hold that thought. First, let's conclude this section. What's being explained clearly is how atheoretic ideas get a hold. There's other things that manifest time includes that he mentions, but that's not the focus of attention. And the explanation arises precisely because of the features that physical time shares with B-time. Okay. So what? Why does it matter? So this is, of course, the background moving past the ABCs, but now why philosophically does it matter? Okay. So in order to explain kind of our sense that time flows, Callender builds on Jim Hartlow's idea of an IBIS, an information gathering and utilizing system, and that also comes up in many other people's work, including Janan. I don't know if in the newspaper, but yeah, so roughly the idea is something like this. An IBIS updates its perceptions of the world at regular intervals, builds models based on memories, and makes decisions based on new perceptions and those models. Now, Callender supplements this in various interesting and important ways. For example, at each point on the whirl line, there are reasons that an IBIS will operate with the notion of a global present. Also why it feels stuck in time, like a kind of felt mobility asymmetry, and how we perceive changes in temporal duration. So feed all that into the IBIS model. Also put in how an IBIS reflects physical temporal asymmetries. Put all that in and explain that in the way that you would otherwise. Now, here's what happens next in the book. He says, we're kind of still missing the whoosh. If we complain that we don't have movement yet, nothing seems to crawl up Albus's world line, thereby making time flow. So what we have is that this memory theory, this stuff that I just told you about Albus, the memory essentially doesn't provide us with our desired feature of something moving through time. And so I think that this is, unfortunately, even though I like these theoretic explanations, I've defended them too, this kind of thing, I think this kind of point will always be reached in the sense that they will also ultimately look incomplete. So it looks very familiar. I think that we should be able to stop here, but let me show you what happens next. So he thinks what's needed is the ingredient of a self that is enduring, meaning wholly present at each time it exists, and that is a character in the story we tell, like narrative accounts. Now, he says, and this is the ambiguity at work, and I think here we see how it does some harm to the explanation. He says, neither of these ideas needs to be or should be understood as having any metaphysical dimension. As for endurantism and perdurantism, like how we persist through time, and he says those are two different ways of carving up the same world. No matter, we simply need a conceptual distinction. Similarly with narrativity, we don't need to make this a constitutional claim. It's just that the enduring self, because it is the subject of our narration. In short, we don't have to read all this, but the idea is, the illusion of the enduring self is responsible for the illusion of the flow of time. What crawls up the world line is not a substantial metaphysical entity, like Biel's moving spotlight, but rather the character in a kind of story. A narrative is being built up the world line. What is crawling up your world line is a story that unfolds up the world line, the story of me and you. That's how we get to the sense that time flows. Okay, so the first small point about this is that persistence is not endurance because there are other accounts of persistence, but the larger point is that rejecting the debate over how we persist is not the same as rejecting the view that we persist by enduring. That this is the same ambiguity again that I'm pointing out, just transposed to the persistence debate. So the two don't go together. He says, we don't need a metaphysical distinction because all he's interested in is what we think, just manifest time. I think that's a non sequitur, and I see two problems with this sense. First of all, the story has to say something. And that content will be not only well delineated but metaphysical because it's about a way for selves to persist. If we think of the two as just different languages, ways of talking about the same thing, then what does the story say? Similarly, in order for the enduring self to be an illusion, it has to not exist. I should say this too. And the same goes for the flow of time. Now, even though I've just shown you a quote with the word illusion in it, Callender also says, I don't really care about whether we call it an illusion or not. Depends on what you mean by that. If you mean something more something broader than perceptual misapprehension, maybe, but it doesn't really matter. Now, I think it does matter by the lights of the book because the whole project is about the nature of manifest time, which is a pretty unified thing, the way he sets it up. And he says manifest time is, thoroughly misleading. It's a model of time that we carry around in our heads from an early age, pervades our relationship to time, and we get it wrong. Manifest time gets physical time wrong. In other words, this kind of piecemeal methodology that is so close to science that we like as naturalists, which I will come back to this also tomorrow. Ultimately, that's not sufficient for his project. Manifest time is a single model and it's near universal. And what we have here is an appearance that's out of sync with reality. That's not just a slip of the tongue, because in that explanation that we just saw, this kind of rejection of metaphysics, temporal metaphysics, as outdated, itself plays a crucial role in the explanation. It's it's what is supposed to license moving back and forth between self and self-conception, you know, having kind of lots of quotation marks. The self crawls up the world line, the self is created. So, long story short, I think it does some philosophical harm here. Now, I want to end this case study on what I think we have, you know, the script of the quotation marks, which takes us kind of roughly back to where we were with the supplemented Ibis model. And ultimately, that's where I would like to stop, but I think we have to earn the philosophical right, basically, and we have to kind of prevent this sort of further thing. So what we have is a series of successive temporal perspectives along a world line, each one of which involves a subject telling a story whose versions build on one another. The subject remembers earlier and anticipates later versions of the story. Nothing crawls anywhere, but you know, I think that's maybe okay for reasons that I'm going to talk about as we go along. So in sum, about this ambiguity, in this book, Callender's 2, the ABCs play an ambiguous role, and I think that it is somewhat worrisome. Okay, now, bigger picture again. Suppose that there is this kind of conceptual indecision. Where does one go from there? So I find this an uncomfortable place to be, and of course, as I told you, I like the letter-free vision. B is not unlettered. So what about meta B? Eh? A friend of meta B has an easy way to resolve the conceptual indecision to stop the lettered philosophizing. I'm genuinely torn about this, but I see a significant downside, which is that meta B just mutes you on the first order level. Can't say any of those things that Hagrid is saying about basic mathematics, which I understand, I like, I think it's interesting. Can't say, I mean, this is a little bit less of a loss for me, but Callender cannot offer this explanation. You can't make any first order contribution to this dispute because there isn't one, or at least because the meta B stance says, I'm not going to do that. You know, I think this works for a lot of people, but I'm not sure how many of them think about time that much, and certainly none who think about temporal experience. So for me, I'm not sure. There is one upside though, as I just said, which is I actually think it's nice to have no big overarching problem of manifest time like we saw earlier, but rather just lots of little questions. And meta B gives you that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
I just have a general question about meta B, maybe or that we're going back to the bigger picture of this with temperature. So meta B rejects entering in the letter debate.
Yes.
But I think there are different reasons why I want to do that. And I wasn't completely sure if you're deciding for one. So now I can think of three.
Okay. Yeah.
So one would be to say this is really verbal dispute. I don't think that's what meta B is saying, because then meta B wouldn't be B. I mean, then at least it wouldn't deserve the name meta B in any sense. The second would be, and that seems most attractive maybe, that it's kind of a category mistake. So the atheist is saying something like the stone is awake, the theorist says no, the stone is not awake. Maybe that's kind of closer to true, but actually it's just a mistake, just because the stone's not. And the third would be, well, this is the kind of question we cannot find an answer to ever, so it's just not helpful to ask this kind of question because we will never answer it. Even if maybe it's meaningful, so maybe it's not purely verbal, but we will just have to be able to answer it. And I think some things that sound a bit like a category mistake, kind of. I was just curious. One last thing about this. So if it is a category mistake, then maybe it is a metaphysical position in the sense that it says time is not of this category, whatever this category is.
Great. Okay, so first about the first two options. The meta B stance, the reason I use a B, I mean for both of those options to be compatible with meta B, although meta B is not committed to them. So I mean for both of those to be compatible with meta B and reasons you might have adopted. If you think it's verbal, no reason to try to adjudicate. If you think it's the categories, depending of course exactly what that means, maybe that could be a motivation to move to meta B. So I don't mean for the B to mean that it's a version of the B theory. The reason I chose that label is mostly because of this back and forth that I see in the roughly B theoretic camp. It's just a stance. Now the third one I want to think about a little bit. So if the idea is this is a welcome question and something that we would like to it's something that you can ask and we can't find the answer. I actually think that that's pretty close to how, I would think of that as a lettered stance because, maybe we can't find the answer to a lot of metaphysical questions. We're trying to, conditionally argue about pros and cons of various views, and people adopt various views, but can we know? Maybe not. But I think it's a great question also because it's important for me to demarcate my preferred view, which I'll tell you about tomorrow, from that. I think of that third thing as not meta B, not compatible with meta B. Thank you. Does that answer your question? Or do you want to?
Yeah, so it's definitely not the third. Now I wasn't sure if you decided between the first and the second.
No, so I don't want to build in either to meta B. That's why it's so minimal. It's certainly not a metaphysical view. It's barely a view. It's just a stance. It's an attitude, and I would like it to be. I mean for it to be compatible with both of the first two. If I understand the second one correctly, but maybe there's some readings of it that lead into the letters again. Thank you. But I definitely want to make a mental note of the third one as well. There might be more things to say about that. Thank you. So I was telling you about one thing that I like about meta B. Like I said earlier, I think it might be good for thinking about manifest time, for there not to be this big overarching problem. And I think of meta B as a way of avoiding that by fiat, because the big overarching problem is going to be, I think, how atheistic ideas get a hold in a non-atheistic world. You don't have that. You're not thinking in those terms then. That's nice, but I think that and this is now getting into the territory of what I think of as Ismail's view. Sorry, Ismail or Ismail? Ismail. What I think of as Genev's view, and other people that I think of as endorsing the tenseless passage view. I told you already. I like. Now, I want to end on kind of. This is from step 2 to step 3. End on telling you why I take this to be a reason for a friend of letter theory to move in the direction of tenseless passage. I think what we want is a position that's in the letter-free spirit. In other words, in the case of tenseless passage, that wants to sort of overcome or transcend the A-B dichotomy, which I think is exactly what a tenseless passage view like Geneva tries to do. But because a view like that is trying to overcome the distinction as opposed to just dismissing it, it's still it does justice to the question. It's not a muted response, which I think is also helpful because I do think the question is central in metaphysics of science. It's connected to other disputes, I think. Okay, so a little bit more about that. This is now a little bit compressed. I'll talk more about that tomorrow, but tenseless passage, right? It's views that say, I have the passage thing already here in the block universe. What do you mean? Do you mean robust passage, the thing that A theorists are positing you have that in the B theory? That's the problem that I will be talking about tomorrow, the problem that kind of pushes me to far outer reaches resources. But so this is a problem, I think. What can this passage be saying? What is it that's passage just is succession means? What can we be saying there? But it has a lot in common with metaphy. Compare there is nothing more to it's all already there. The difference is that what's all already there is passage, the thickest kind there is, the most robust kind there is, conceptually. So it retains key advantages, I think, but yeah, it has other advantages that metaphy doesn't have. Right. Let me stop there and see if there's things you'd like to ask.
Can we go a little bit back to the beginning? What's McKinsey?
Yes.
So, what's wrong with updating also the questions? So, you do agree with this?
I think that's great.
Yeah.
That would be great. I don't think of well, I guess I think if what you're asking is does quantum gravity indicate eternalism, I don't think of that as updating the question. It's not in every way.
But it is. Yeah. So I mean more like should we not really try to just draw all the questions from the naturalist endeavor rather than even stepping to the theory with our armchair question. Then we just forget all about the armchair question and just look at the physics and do this kind of sorting and purifying of and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So if you're asking, is that what I would like?
Yeah.
I think that tenseless passage gets you there in a philosophically honest way, if we can make sense of the slogan.
Yes.
That's also why. That's not just why I want to get there, but that's also where I think a lot of people must be.
Yeah.
And that's why I feel it has to be said. Yeah.
So this is completely compatible with your own take, right? Okay. Okay. Just.
Yeah. That's what I want.
Yes. Good. Yeah. This makes sense.
Yeah.
But then methodologically, you're still working, of course, in a way by criticizing the others. But you could also say, I have no interest in what they're saying. Let me just start with the big tabula rasa.
I think now when you say criticizing the others, you mean
A and B.
And this is, of course, that's I think what I mean when I say this is done from the armchair. The third and fourth, like what I will be talking about tomorrow, and what I was talking about. Yeah, right. So it's like, I'm not where I would like to be. I feel like I need to do some more work in order to be able to be there. That's what it is. I think that will be also probably the sense that you'll get tomorrow. I like these tenseless passive positions. I see them in a lot of places in metaphysics and philosophy of physics. And Carlo Rovelli has got a paper that I think commits him to this tenseless passage. I think that there's a reason tenseless passage hasn't really caught on in metaphysics. There's probably an unsolved problem about how to interpret it slowly.
You were first, is it? No? Hello.
I was going to suggest going at the very end again.
It's okay. I can let me do it.
I have a question on the middle part, but
maybe we'll go to the middle.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You mentioned more about meta B.
Yes.
It's like, this is a kind of simple question. How common is it in the literature?
Meta B?
Yeah.
I mean, the term is new.
Yeah, it's your term.
Yeah. So I mean, basically this appears in something that that's forthcoming in a book based on a workshop called Naturalizing the Philosophy of Time and it's also in other work that's under review. Actually, I'm going to come back to it tomorrow because it also changes how I need to tell you a little bit about temporal experience as well. It changes a little bit.
Well, I guess we're going to talk about it tomorrow, but on the last slide.
The last slide is this one. Yeah.
So TP says that what's included in the PP theory block universe is
I think this will become clear tomorrow when I give you some quotes. Israel and others have where you get a sense of the flavor of what tenseless passage is supposed to be. It's like, I think it comes about when somebody wants to kind of like honor the question, but also not really like take one of the sides. I mean, it's not just the philosophical temperament that I like it. I think there's no other philosophically honest way out of the ABCs.
Thank you. I have maybe a worry is too strong, but I'm wondering whether we couldn't reread Huggett in particular, but maybe also Callender, a bit more charitably, as not sort of being ambiguous about that, but just sort of really wanting to go for a meta-B kind of view, but at the same time trying to gesture at the person who's moved by the question of the dynamics, to say something in a language that they can relate to somehow, in some sense engage in or address the first order questions still. Maybe perhaps not completely always consistently and everything, but still, if you sort of charitably look at what they're trying to do, maybe reconcilable with the meta-B approach.
So, I mean, I don't think so, but that's an excellent question. That's exactly what I've been looking for, I suppose. I don't think so. I mean, so maybe taking them one by one. I mean, Calendars is a whole book, so that's it. Actually, I think that makes it a little bit clearer in his case, maybe because both the project of trying to account for manifest time and his answer, I think, would not be compatible with meta-B, as I understand. So when I offer this disambiguation, it's not supposed to be a Trojan horse, but it is a dilemma. Meta-B, it's like you can be a meta-B person if you're working on something else. It's very hard, I think, to not say anything on the first order level. You can't really, You can do that if you're working on something else, or just working on the metaphysics of time, maybe. Then you can say, like, for example, you can argue that this is a merely verbal dispute.
Could they perhaps maybe reinterpret it then as doing something more along the lines of tenseless passage rather than meta-B?
Right. Yes. So I think for Callender, for example, that's not what actually happens in the book as it is now, but I think that there is a way to stop before the, adding the narrativity stuff about the self. Maybe you can add in other ways, but you don't need that. Which, tenseless passage gives you, because it sort of deflates in a certain way the big overarching problem about manifest time. Now, I don't want to say that there aren't lots of little interesting questions. I want to exactly make room for those. But yeah, if you have that, if you are willing to have that, then I do think you can stop with the memory, theory, the memory account, like the supplemented Eigers. And I think people do that. Actually, I think I see that even implicitly in Jim Hartle's paper. I think that's a natural option. It's just that I think a little more has to be said about how to understand the TP bit, because that's been, like I say, somewhat sidelined, I think, in the metaphysics literature for understandable reasons having to do with this unsolved problem. Like if you ask someone, like, pick on Oliver Cooley, but he, for example, would say, I have no idea how this is a thing. It's just the B theory, and somebody's like pointing to it and saying, I've already got all the A theorist has. Oh yeah, do you? How? Like, so
I'm still confused on the meta B, like how it situates itself in the whole debate philosophy of time.
yes.
And also kind of like the kind of contribution it does. Because if so it's like silent, well, it doesn't care about, it's like a letter free view, so it doesn't care about all the, let's say, theory debate.
Right.
But it doesn't say that, I mean, it just doesn't take any position. So it doesn't say like, it's not, I mean, it's all around, or like, you should, so in a sense, like, is it, like, well, one question can I even understand that the position is like, is meta B still compatible with the A theory view, for example? Like, you can be meta B in the sense of like saying like, I mean, the definition I wrote down is that there is a succession of times. But, I mean, if that's just what meta B is still compatible with all the A theory, B theory debate, right?
Yeah. So, right, so, hang on, let me go to this slide that I think is good with this. So I don't mean for it to be compatible with the A theory or the B theory, but yours is an important question. I think so when I've started to kind of like talk to philosophers of time about this distinction, well, it's an important question. So I think it's actually here. Okay, so so meta B, you say, suppose that it talks about a succession of times, right? So what I want to say is that in a way, again, we could interpret this in different ways. If somebody talks about a succession of time, yes, maybe they are B theorists, maybe they're an A theorist, or maybe they're a meta B person. What makes them one or the other is, if I mean by succession of times, and if I mean there's only that at the fundamental level there are only temporal relations at the fundamental level of temporal reality, then I'm a B theorist, and I could be talking about a succession of times. If I mean by that at a less than fundamental level of temporal reality there are B relations because at a more fundamental level there are A properties or similar things, then I'm an A theorist. The reason I say friends of meta B can also talk of a succession of times is because, well, take a physicist who's never thought explicitly or implicitly about the ABCs. I don't think I have any reason to say that they can't talk of a succession of, well, times or, temporal relations between space-time points. Of course, they can and they do. And I think that's compatible with meta B because all that meta B is doing is not engaging with the question of dynamicity. And I mean, another way to see that that's compatible with talk of temporal or spatio-temporal relations in physics as it is done there, I think, is, like we saw yesterday and like we'll see tomorrow, that, for example, relativity theory is interpreted by metaphysicians and by philosophers of physics in many different ways. I think the physics itself, or the talk of spatial-temporal relations doesn't commit one to any of these and is compatible with not engaging with the A-B question.
Okay. So it's like, at a different level, but I see like a completely like alternative view to.
It's not a metaphysical, like it's not a view in temporal metaphysics.
Yeah, but it's like an alternative. Like you cannot have both. Like it's in alternative in this sense. Like it's like fully incompatible with any metaphysical view.
Well, of course it can be combined with other metaphysical views. I would have to hear which one you have in mind to see if
any metaphysical view on time.
It's an interesting question. Maybe if you include in that, let's say, substantialist, relationalist kind of disputes, or
But persistence debate.
Say again.
The persistent debate.
Well, so by itself not logically incompatible, but I suspect that I would see some connections, but I'd have to do some work to show that they are if they have a particular position in a persistence debate. I would want to look into whether I don't also think that they might be at least treating the question of dynamicity also as substantive. There are some papers, I think, that see these disputes as connected. Yeah, it's a good question.
That's
Right.
Just a remark on also pejoratism linked to, so you were discussing these results from experimental philosophy and how much they matter. And in particular was citing that apparently presentism is maybe more
prevalent.
And last year I think I heard a talk by Chris similar here, but about the endurantism debate, where the abstract was more, actually endurantism is not, as everyone thinks, more prevalent, but actually intuitions are either completely unsaid or maybe even more towards endurantism. And in combination, this gives a very odd picture. A picture that very few philosophers at least would endorse.
I don't know if I'd go as far as that. If you mean, so you're saying you would have expected people to be generally endurantists if they are generally atheists. You would have.
That's maybe an even more radical departure from what the philosophers think. Not only are they wrong about the intuitions, but also about which.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm sure, I don't know if this helps you wondering, but as I'm sure, Christy and her co-authors would acknowledge, generally speaking, people's metaphysical beliefs, that's how they put it, are not well worked out. A lot of our beliefs are inconsistent when even we have them, So, I don't know whether they think of this as surprising. It's an interesting question to check, maybe. But of course, the whole spirit of the X5 approach is we're going to check. Our intuition is not what, that's not what matters.
So should we thank Natalja again?